Watch your head. It's my playroom. I can record everything and, keep a record in case I need it. This is the patch bay, and you run these cables to any room in the house, and you can listen in. I got Onassis, I got Cardinal Cook, I got everybody. You have to be willing to do anything to anyone to win. You have to be willing to exploit your enemies and instill fear.
Well, that's illegal, right?
Oh, it's illegal? Donald, wake up. When I tried the Rosenbergs, I wanted so badly to see those pinko kikes fry for what they did. Now, Judge Kaufman had no trouble sending Julius to the chair, but Ethel was a mother with young kids. They wanted her to live, as if that's some sort of special immunity for betraying your country. So during the trial, I'd slip out at lunch to a phone booth and call Kaufman. Technically ex parte conversations, they're not allowed, but when democracy is at stake, you're damn right I'm willing to violate a few technicalities. I don't care if she's a mother with young kids. She betrayed our country, and she has to die. You have to set an example and put this woman to death. She's a traitor. Do you understand what I'm telling you?
Before Epstein, before compromat became a buzzword, Roy Cohn was there. He was 24 when he helped send Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to the electric chair. A kid prosecutor, a wunderkind. The press called him brilliant. The truth? He was dangerous, cold, calculated. And already playing in shadows most men never crawl out of. Cohn had secrets, big ones. He liked young boys, cruised the slums of New York looking for teenage hustlers. Sometimes for himself, sometimes for his friends, powerful men with names that echoed through marble halls. J. Edgar Hoover, Cardinal Spellman, Joe McCarthy. Washington royalty with a taste for control and a weakness for things they could never admit in daylight. By 1953, the country was on fire. McCarthy lit the match. Cohn poured the gasoline. The Red Scare, the Lavender Scare. They were hunting enemies foreign and domestic, real and imagined. First it was the communists. Then it was the gay people. Then it was whoever stood in the way. Cohn was everywhere, grinning behind McCarthy at the hearings, whispering names, leaking stories, bending the law. He didn't care about ideology. He cared about leverage, power, blackmail. He could destroy a man with a phone call and a smile. Dwight Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10,450. It banned gay people from working in the federal government. National security risk, they called it. The kind of language that sounded clean on paper, but left bodies in its wake. People outed by Cohn and McCarthy didn't just lose their jobs. Some lost everything. Lives. Reputations. Some took the elevator to the roof and didn't come back. Cohn was untouchable. He denied everything. Even as the rumors swirled and the bodies piled up, he kept walking, laughing, lying. It was theater to him, politics as a contact sport. His father, Albert Cohn, had been a respected judge, a Roosevelt appointee, a man of law and dignity. He tried to raise Roy right, pushed him into Columbia early, got him into the Southern District of New York before he could shave properly. But the kid didn't learn right from wrong. He learned results. At 20, he was a law clerk. At 23, he was making headlines. The Rosenberg case made him famous. McCarthy made him notorious. People in Washington saw two Roy Cohns. One was the courtroom assassin, sharp, ruthless, grinning like a shark. The other was the good son, soft-spoken, deferential, charming in that slick Manhattan way. But underneath it all was the same thing: hunger. He wanted power, and he didn't care who got hurt. McCarthy called them Fifth Amendment communists. Cohn twisted the Constitution into a weapon. If you pleaded the Fifth, you were guilty. If you pushed back, you were a traitor. He coined new phrases: Fifth Amendment spy, to make the law sound dirty. Due process was for suckers. At night, while other young men chased girls, Roy slipped into the company of older, richer men. Kingmakers, power brokers, predators. He got the best tables, the inside scoop, his name in the columns. Winchell, Lyons. They all picked up when Roy called. He was everywhere and nowhere. A whisper campaign in a three-piece suit. But there was something bigger going on behind the headlines, something darker. America was changing. The war was over, and the Cold War had begun. The Soviets, once allies, were now the enemy. But the shift wasn't instant. At first, US generals had traveled to Moscow, watching Stalin's army clear minefields with human waves. Soldiers marching straight into explosions, sacrificing themselves without hesitation. The Americans were stunned, impressed. This was no weak ally, this was a machine. Still, the alliance had held. The US, the Soviets, and Britain. But Britain was starting to fade, and everyone knew it. There was a Roman-built village in France, untouched by war. Not by the Nazis, not by the French. Churchill begged the Americans, "Don't bomb it." They agreed. Then, after he went to sleep, they leveled it. Message sent. The empire had shifted. America was in charge now. But to hold that power, they needed enemies. They needed fear. The mob money, the drug money, the Banana Republic cutouts, those were still there, but they weren't enough. To build an intelligence empire, you needed legitimacy. You needed Congress. You needed television. So the hearings began. Kefauver's hearings brought the mob into American living rooms. Gambling, unions, blood and money. But McCarthy's show blew it all away. Treason, communists in the government, perverts in the Pentagon. The country couldn't look away. And Roy Cohn? He was right there in the spotlight, pulling strings, feeding names, ruining lives, building a machine out of fear, secrecy, and surveillance. It was a new kind of war. Not tanks and trenches, dossiers and denials. Dirt was currency now. And Roy Cohn was rich. He had learned every trick. He knew how to get convictions. He knew how to make the headlines scream. But he never learned the line you don't cross. Maybe because no one ever made him pay for crossing it. In the end, Roy Cohn was a fixer, a hatchet man, a kingmaker, the godfather of a new American order, one built not on ideals, but on leverage. He was the dark prelude to everything that would follow. Watergate, Iran-Contra, Epstein. Before Compromat had a name, Roy Cohn had already weaponized it. And America still hasn't cleaned up the mess. America never really declared war on organized crime. Not seriously. Not the way they declared war on drugs or poverty or communism. Because the truth was they couldn't. Too many players were in the game. Senators, judges, CIA men, media moguls. Everyone had a piece. Everyone had something to lose. Distraction was the real currency. Feed the public a new scandal, a new threat, a new enemy. Keep them looking sideways. That way, no one ever connects the dots. It's the same trick they use now, different names, same playbook. But in 1957, something shifted. Organized crime, the Mafia, the unions, the hidden hand behind American capitalism, stepped out of the shadows. The McClellan Committee was formed to investigate labor racketeering. The target, the mob. Senator John McClellan had help. His chief counsel was a hard-nosed, tireless bulldog named Bobby Kennedy. His brother Jack, John Kennedy, was already on the rise, with ambitions no one could ignore. Bobby took the fight personally. He wanted blood. He tore into the Teamsters, dug up alliances between labor bosses and gangsters, and then the trail led him somewhere unexpected. Back to Roy Cohn. It was the same Roy Cohn he'd worked with in the early 50s during the McCarthy hearings. Back then, Bobby had been a junior attorney, wide-eyed, loyal, still believing the war against communism was real. But over time, he saw the wires, the theatre, the con, the smirking Roy Cohn sitting next to McCarthy, running hit jobs disguised as patriotism. Bobby started to think the whole thing was a lie, a psyop meant to terrify the press, choke Hollywood, silence dissent, and scare anyone who dared criticize the military-industrial machine. This wasn't about communists. This was about control. Now Bobby wanted justice, and at the center of it was Cohn again, not just a political operator, but a fixer for the mob. Bobby had a target, Carlo Gambino, New York's quiet Don, the man who didn't need headlines because he controlled the people who wrote them, but Gambino had protection, Roy Cohn. So, Bobby made his move. If you want the Don, you take out the shield. That meant going after Roy. And Roy was vulnerable. Not in court, but in the shadows. Bobby knew. Everyone whispered about it. The stories weren't just rumors. There was blackmail material. Dirty, dangerous stuff, tied to J. Edgar Hoover himself. Here's what Bobby had. In the late 50s, Hoover was a regular at the apartment of Louis Rosensteel, ex-bootlegger, mob-connected, and a close friend of Meyer Lansky. Rosensteel's wife, Susan, saw everything. She said Hoover and Roy Cohn were involved, sexually, romantically, politically. She remembered the night it all came into focus. Rosensteel told her they were going out, to the Plaza Hotel, not the front entrance, side door, quiet. Elevator, up. A sign on the suite's door read, "Do not disturb." They knocked. Cohn opened the door. Inside, there was a man, stocky, with heavy features, sitting cross-legged in a black dress, ruffled lace, stockings, heels, a black wig, false eyelashes. Roy smiled. "I'd like you to meet Mary," he said. But Susan knew exactly who it was. She'd seen Hoover before. This was him. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, in full drag. According to Susan, 2 young boys were brought in. What followed was an orgy. Hoover and Cohn, Rosensteel and the boys. The head of federal law enforcement compromised beyond belief. Rosensteel made it clear. This is leverage. Hoover couldn't touch Lansky or anyone in the outfit. If he tried, this came out. This was the insurance policy, blackmail at the highest level. Cohn was at the center of it, not just a lawyer, not just a hatchet man. He was the courier between the government and the underworld. He had Hoover's secrets. He had Kennedy's attention. And he had the dirt that kept Hoover silent while the mob built its empire. Bobby Kennedy saw it all, the tangled network of favors, threats, and perversions that kept the system running. And now he wanted to burn it down. But this wasn't a simple war. Roy Cohn wasn't just a man. He was a mechanism, pulling strings for both sides, feeding dirt to the press, shielding gangsters, building cases, killing others in the court of public opinion. He operated on immunity, not legal, but political, and sexual. He knew what people were ashamed of. Roy's defense wasn't a lawyer. It was a secret. So, when Bobby Kennedy turned the lights on, the roaches scattered. But Roy stayed in the room, smiling, like he always did. Because when you hold the dirt, on Hoover, on the Kennedys, on the government itself, you don't run, you wait, and you remind them who really runs the show. In 2016, Donald J. Trump shocked the world. A real estate hustler turned TV pitchman walked into the Oval Office. But if you'd been paying attention, you wouldn't have been surprised. Because this wasn't about policy. It was about power. and Trump had been trained by a man who wrote the manual on it. That man was Roy Cohn. The moment Trump got elected, the walls started closing in. Russia, collusion, compromat, hidden bank wires, secret meetings, shady connections. He needed legal firepower. Not lawyers, killers, guys who didn't talk procedure, guys who made enemies disappear. Trump didn't say John Adams or Clarence Darrow. He said one name, Roy Cohn. It was a signal, and the ones who understood politics, the real kind, the kind that leaks blood, they heard it loud and clear. Roy had been dead 30 years, but the invocation said everything. Roy Cohn had been Trump's mentor, protector, and architect. He taught him how to intimidate, how to distract, how to deny everything and never ever apologize. And Roy didn't just mold Trump's public image, he molded the way Trump thought. Roy knew where the bodies were buried because he helped bury them. Trump wasn't just taught by a lawyer. He was taught by the lawyer, the one who helped execute the Rosenbergs, who sat next to McCarthy during the witch hunts, who built empires out of blackmail and fear. A man who moved through DC and New York like a spectre, smiling through indictments, whispering to presidents, turning whispers into weapons. Cohn was a closeted gay man who ran with Hoover and Spellman, both also closeted, both obsessed with hiding what everyone already suspected. Roy was deeper than just shame or secrecy. He liked boys. Young. He cruised the slums of Manhattan not for company, but for leverage, the kind you could put on tape, use, weaponize. He warned Trump about all of it, told him about the two-way mirrors in Vegas and foreign hotel suites, warned him that the real players recorded everything and used it when the time was right. Trump listened. He learned, not just how to avoid the trap, but how to set it. That's why, even with Epstein, there's still no tape. Not of Trump. Because the student paid attention. And Roy was a hell of a teacher. You wanted a casino license in Atlantic City? Roy made the call. You wanted the zoning board to disappear in Queens? Roy wrote the letter. You wanted to destroy a contractor, or bribe a city inspector, or smear a reporter? Roy had the playbook. He got Trump what he wanted, because Trump wasn't just his client. He was his final project. So when Trump, cornered by investigators, whispered, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" it wasn't a cry for help. It was a warning. He wasn't looking to clean up the system. He was looking to run it. The way Roy taught him. Trump's agenda was never moral. It was transactional. Always had been. Roy didn't raise a president. He built a weapon. And back in 1981, as the Reagan era dawned, Roy was still standing, older, sicker, surrounded by White House power and DC insiders who smiled in public and whispered in private. The IRS was back on his ass, and Roy, looking around the room, sneered. "I've been dealing with this since Bobby Kennedy." He wasn't wrong. The vendetta between Roy and Bobby Kennedy went back decades. Bobby had worked with him in the McCarthy hearings. Robert watched how Roy operated, and hated every inch of it. When Kennedy rose to power, he made it personal. In 1961, IRS audits started landing on Roy's desk like bombs. That wasn't a coincidence. It was Bobby's quiet payback. Bobby knew Roy's weaknesses, the lovers, the paper trails, the favors. He knew Hoover was untouchable. But Roy could be bled. Roy screamed, blamed the Kennedys, blamed the system, said the IRS was Nazi level, Soviet style. But he fought it, and like always, walked away. Indicted 4 times, acquitted 4 times, the Teflon before Gotti. In public, he smiled. In private, he seethed. Now it's 1981. Roy's 54, but looks older. The face still stirs something in anyone old enough to remember black and white hearings and McCarthy's drunken rants. The scar down the nose, the snake eyes, the smirk that said, "I know something you don't." The press still hated him. He liked it that way. "My scare value is very high," he said once. He didn't send polite letters. He sent warnings. He knew that reputation was the real power, the kind that walks into a courtroom and wins before opening its mouth. And yet, here he was, respectable, in the Reagan inner circle. Studio 54 one night, the White House the next. From Onassis to Steinbrenner to Holston, Roy collected famous friends like trophies, then used them when he needed cover. His life was built on two truths. Power fears exposure, and nothing silences a man faster than his own secrets. He had plenty on Hoover. Hoover in drag, Hoover in bed with boys. Hoover blackmailed by Lansky's people through a friendly bootlegger named Rosensteel. Roy had been there. Roy had the names. Roy had the leverage. So, when Trump mentioned Roy Cohn in 2017, he wasn't just reminiscing. He was reminding people what game he was playing. Because Trump knew what Roy knew. If you can't control the law, control the lawyers. If you can't beat the press, feed them garbage until they choke. If you can't stop the investigations, distract the public until they forget why they started. Trump never planned to drain the swamp. He planned to flood it and make sure he owned the lifeboats. And the only name he ever really trusted to teach him how. Roy fucking Cohn. Nobody can agree on what the Mafia really was. Some say it was pure evil, a plague that corrupted everything it touched. Others, usually with blood on their hands or money in their pockets, argue it was just business. Brutal, yes, but necessary. The truth? Somewhere in between. What the Mafia became was monstrous. Even Charles Lucky Luciano, the man who built it into an empire, couldn't stomach what it turned into. By 1958, during the McClellan Committee hearings on union corruption, Luciano was watching from exile in Italy. His reaction? Relief. "It's a good thing," he said. "About time somebody started cleaning up those damn unions." The house he built had turned into a sewer. In the beginning, the idea was simple: supply and demand. The American people wanted gambling, booze, girls, and hot merchandise, goods that fell off a truck and into their hands without taxes or receipts. The Mafia delivered. The companies collected insurance. Everyone won. They took the profits and invested like tycoons. Hotels, real estate, shipping, trucking, logistics, the bones of the American economy. It was capitalism without a conscience, run not by Ivy League bankers in suits, but by streetwise gangsters who knew how to make a dollar scream. But here's the catch. They weren't allowed to have what they had. These were criminals, and the world treated them like criminals, even as it took their money. The rackets, gambling machines, unions, stolen goods, were illegal, so the wise guys thrived in the margins, where society disapproved just enough to outlaw it, but not enough to ignore the kickbacks. And when the politicians needed help, the Mafia was there. Need to fix a union vote. Call the mob. Need a journalist silenced. Call the mob. Need bus drivers, longshoremen, garbage men to play ball. Call the mob. The Mafia wasn't just a parasite on the American economy. It was a hidden artery. Luciano and Meyer Lansky used to brag about it. 80% of what they made, they said, went right back into the system, into the pockets of politicians, judges, cops, commissioners, bureaucrats. They called it tribute. The politicians called it campaign support. But here's the trick. The mob only backed the ones who burned through their cut fast. If a guy knew how to save, how to get comfortable, he was dangerous. Sooner or later he'd clean house. But the ones who couldn't hold on to a dollar, you could trust them. They always came back for more. It wasn't just corruption. It was strategy. And it paid off. By the 1960s and 70s, the American economy was roaring. The middle class, white, suburban, nuclear family America was living like royalty. 2 cars in the driveway, a house, mortgage almost paid off, a steady job that covered the bills and then some, paid vacations, health insurance, free college, good schools, safe streets, weekends with the kids, nights spent reading the paper, watching Cronkite, maybe catching a documentary on public television. You bought American, you worked American, and you believed in America. What you didn't see was the machinery behind it. You didn't see who was greasing the wheels or what was rotting underneath. But, slowly, you started to notice. A quiet mistrust took root, of the government, of the suits in Washington, of the CIA, the FBI. Things didn't add up. The official story was always a little too neat. That mistrust didn't happen overnight. It took decades. Decade by decade, layer by layer, the illusion cracked. Propaganda isn't just slogans and speeches. It's in the air, in the ink, in the silence. By then, the mob wasn't just a crime syndicate. It was part of the American fabric, hidden, essential, and rotting it from the inside out. Aristocrats, elites, monarchs, popes, clergy. It doesn't matter what mask they wear. They don't see people the same way. Not then. Not now. Especially not the ruling class. For centuries, writers, historians, even whistleblowers inside the system tried to explain how the elites looked down on everyone else. One of the most effective? Charles Dickens. In the 1830s, Britain, Dickens wasn't writing fiction. He was writing documentary. Oliver Twist pulled back the curtain on how the system treated poor white working-class children. These weren't foreigners. These were native-born English kids, blonde hair, blue eyes, and they were treated like rats. Orphans and paupers were thrown into workhouses that operated more like prisons. They got gruel for food and beatings for discipline. Children as young as 5 were put to work in coal mines and textile mills, often for 14-hour shifts, 6 days a week. What wasn't written in novels was worse. Kids lost fingers to machinery. Girls were raped. Boys were beaten or killed for talking back. Many died before the age of 10. Typhus, diphtheria, cholera, diseases that could have been prevented with clean water and basic hygiene, wiped them out in thousands. But clean water didn't reach slums. It was reserved for those with titles and estates. Even as the calendar rolled into the 1900s, little changed. Slums in London, New York, and Chicago were vertical graveyards. One toilet might be shared by 20 families. Apartments, if you could call them that, often had no windows, no heat, no ventilation. In New York's Five Points district, overcrowding was so bad you could find 10 to 15 people living in a single room. In Whitechapel, London, entire families slept in one bed, surrounded by mold, rats, and fleas. Tuberculosis spread like wildfire. Child prostitution was rampant. The term street Arabs was used to describe homeless children, not affectionately. Girls, some as young as 8, were trafficked in full view of the authorities. Boys were exploited in brothels and on the docks. Nobody cared. The elites wrote it off as urban vice, as if poverty was a choice. The working class, Irish, Polish, Italian, Jewish, German, Russian, were treated like a disposable workforce. They came in waves, worked themselves to death, and were replaced by the next boatload. Tenement deaths were common. So were worksite deaths. If you fell off a scaffold or into a boiler, the boss didn't file paperwork. He hired the next man. That was the deal. You lived short, you died young, and if you complained, you were a socialist, a radical, a problem. To the elites, these people weren't citizens, they were skivvies. Like a captain on a pirate ship looking down at the bottom deck. The galley rats were just bodies to move crates, scrub floors, carry coal, lay bricks, fight wars. And when one dropped dead, another was waiting to take his place. Meanwhile, the upper class lived in Victorian townhouses and Manhattan brownstones, with servants and electric lighting. They had indoor plumbing by the 1880s. Their children saw doctors. Their kitchens had refrigeration before entire neighborhoods even had clean drinking water. It wasn't ignorance, it was indifference. The working class weren't invisible. They were deliberately ignored. The suffering was written about, photographed, mapped, and debated in Parliament and Congress, and then shelved. Because to the people in charge, the poor weren't part of the nation. They were the cost of doing business. The elites never saw it coming. They understood power when it wore crowns, uniforms, or church robes. They understood power when it was traded in boardrooms or parliament. What they didn't understand, at least not at first, was organization on the streets. Not the kind of organization that begged for political reform or staged protests on the docks. This was something darker, smarter. It was built on gambling money, bootleg whiskey, and a brutal sense of business. It started with a man who didn't fit the usual gangster mold. Arnold Rothstein. Educated. Well off. Born into a respectable Jewish family. He dressed like a banker and gambled like a degenerate. Rothstein didn't play cards for fun. He wanted to know if the house was fair. If it weren't, he'd fix it. If it were, he'd figure out how to make it unfair. He was a natural at turning crime into enterprise, and he had the bankroll to back it up. Rothstein's money and influence reached deep into Tammany Hall, the political machine that ran New York. He wasn't just betting on horses, he was betting on laws. Prohibition, which officially hit the books in 1920, was the perfect storm. America had turned alcohol into contraband overnight, creating a black market that would dwarf anything seen before. Rothstein was ready. He had the cash to buy liquor at the source, Scotland, Canada, the Caribbean, and the muscle to move it across borders. The logistics were set like clockwork. Rothstein financed the operation. Frank Costello, an Italian with a talent for diplomacy, handled the shipments. He cut deals with Scottish distillers and French-controlled islands near the US, setting up offshore depots where liquor could be moved without interference. From there, the Italians and Corsicans took over, ferrying the shipments to American waters. The Bug and Meyer mob, Meyer, Lansky, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, handled distribution. They moved it to Charlie Lucky Luciano, who in turn fed it to the networks of men like Vito Genovese and Joe Adonis. By the late 1920s, Luciano wasn't just moving booze. He was learning how power worked. Rothstein gave him the polish, Lansky gave him the strategy, and Luciano's own street smarts made him lethal. When he eliminated Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, the old Sicilian bosses who had ruled New York with paranoia and knives, Luciano reorganized everything. He built the Commission, a national syndicate that didn't care about ethnicity, only profit. Then came the Great Depression. When Wall Street collapsed in 1929, entire industries were on their knees. Banks folded, farms failed, factories shuttered. While businessmen jumped from windows, the mob was flush with cash. Prohibition had made them rich. Liquor, gambling, and rackets didn't suffer during the Depression. They thrived. Luciano and his partners used their cash to buy into trucking companies, shipping lines, construction, restaurants, and nightclubs. They built what Wall Street couldn't: liquidity. They also discovered something more powerful than money: unions. If you controlled the dock workers, the teamsters, the garment cutters, you controlled the flow of goods. If you controlled the votes of millions of union members, you controlled politicians. Rothstein might have taught Luciano how to bribe a man, but now they were figuring out how to elect him. By the 1930s, mob influence inside unions gave the working class a bargaining chip it had never had before. The mob didn't care about ideology or socialism. They cared about leverage. But the result was the same. Stronger unions meant better pay and better working conditions for the rank and file. Jobs stayed in America. Wages rose. It was bloody and corrupt, but it worked. Jimmy Hoffa summed it up decades later. If you want progress, you pay for it. You spend a little beer along the way. And if that meant painting houses, a mob term for murder, so be it. By the 1950s and 1960s, the blueprint that Luciano and Lansky laid in the 1930s was paying off. America entered what people now call a golden age. The working class, particularly white, union-backed families, lived better than royalty in some countries. 2 cars in the driveway, paid vacations, health insurance, college degrees, pensions. All of it made possible because unions could twist arms in Washington, and behind those unions were men who had clawed their way out of the gutters. Men the elites had once called expendable. But while the mob was consolidating domestic power, the real elites, the aristocrats of finance, politics, and foreign policy, were thinking further ahead. They were already looking toward Asia, building economic bridges to China even in the 1940s, laying groundwork that would come to fruition decades later under Nixon. And America itself made a fatal mistake after World War II. The Marshall Plan poured billions into rebuilding Europe. On paper, it was a masterstroke, a way to stop communism and create allies. In reality, it rebuilt European factories and industries that would later compete with American manufacturing. Once Europe recovered, they didn't need American goods. The economic payback stopped. The US had financed a rival without realizing it. Luciano, sitting in Italy, understood the long game better than most politicians. He once said that the investments he made in the 1930s were paying off in the 1960s. He wasn't wrong, but the ruling class was playing a longer game still, a 100-year game, and that's where America started to lose the edge it had built. America was always an illusion. That was fine, as long as the lie stayed within its own borders. Land of hope and glory, they called it. Just don't look too closely. Don't look at the slavery or the segregation that followed. Don't look at the child labor, the sweatshops, the working poor. Don't look at the women trafficked in brothels from Chicago to New Orleans. Don't look at the white working class buried under debt and factory soot, treated as if they didn't even exist. Because when the illusion is contained, when it's only your own people living inside the lie, you can manage it. But by the 1950s, the illusion had to go global. The European empires had collapsed. Britain was done. France was bleeding. The old colonial powers were either bankrupt or busy putting out fires across Africa and Asia. America saw an opening, a chance to step in, piece by piece, and take control of the world. Only one real obstacle stood in the way: the Soviet Union. And the only reason they mattered was because they'd built a bomb. America took the stage as the world's new sheriff, the land of freedom, defender of democracy, backed by a constitution that promised rights, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, now not just for Americans, but for everyone. That was the sales pitch. Washington told its citizens that what they had, 2 cars, a house, a job, peace, the rest of the world deserved too. And it was America's duty to deliver it. But Americans weren't buying it. Not really. Deep down, they knew it wasn't true. America was a fractured country, still segregated in the South, still reeling from the Civil War a century later, still unwilling to let a Catholic, John F. Kennedy, into the White House without suspicion. The idea that a country that couldn't get its own house in order was ready to police the world. That was a fantasy. Beneath the slogans and speeches, it was the same ruling class, the same elite networks, secret societies, Masonic ties, old European money dressed up in American clothes, same bosses, new suits. Only now they had nukes and a blank check. They weren't bringing peace. They were bringing control. And they were ready to fight anyone who stood in their way. The real threat wasn't communism. It was the risk that the mask would slip. that people would see America not as the shining city on a hill, but as a rising empire, that the world's self-proclaimed liberator was actually a conqueror, not the envoy of peace, but the backer of coups, the financier of proxy wars, the hand behind dictators. From Iran in 53 to Guatemala in 54, from Vietnam to Chile, America didn't spread freedom. It protected its assets. It protected its businesses. Oil, rubber, minerals, ports, shipping lanes, anything that could fuel the machine. And if that meant arming warlords or toppling governments, so be it. The goal wasn't democracy, it was dominance. Globalism before the country was even ready for it. The American people had just finished fighting one world war and barely understood what the last one had cost. They weren't asking for empire. But the men at the top had already made that decision. If you're working class or poor in today's world, odds are you don't have your local politician's number. You don't know how to reach him, where he operates, or who to call when you need help. And why would you? He probably doesn't care, not unless you've got 5 figures to throw his way. Drop $10,000 into the right hands and you'll get his attention. Keep donating and the door opens wider. A callback, a staff contact, maybe even his private email. And just like that, you're in a different America. Legal favors, contract opportunities, access to public resources, all of them unlocked. The working man's still chasing rent. You're chasing government bids. Politicians aren't born greedy. They're just like anyone else, until the money shows up. It's the old trick, the man who gets rich and finds out he's still poor. One guy works all week, comes home to a modest house, greeted by his kids and his wife. He's content, he earns enough. That's one definition of wealth. But then there's the other guy, hungrier, always looking up. He finally makes millions. He's ready to buy his dream Ferrari until he walks into the dealership and sees 5 more models that cost 10 times as much. Suddenly, the car he came for looked cheap. That hunger? It doesn't go away. It multiplies. There's always something shinier. And that's how greed works, especially in American politics. This isn't new. In the 1920s, politicians were just as hungry. That hunger helped push through one of the most corrupt and consequential laws in US history, the Volstead Act. On the surface, it was about morality. In reality, it was about power, money, and global influence. Prohibition wasn't just about banning booze. It was about controlling it. And some say it wasn't even America's idea. There's a theory that it started with the Irish, more specifically, Irish nationalists looking to fund a private army. At the time, the only export Ireland had that could generate serious revenue was whiskey. But British control made it hard to move. The moment Prohibition passed in America, which changed. Suddenly the legal distributors were shut down, and the only ones moving whiskey were criminals and nationalists. Irish whiskey started flowing to the US, and guns flowed back to Ireland. The IRA was born the same year the Volstead Act passed, 1919. Coincidence? Maybe not. Across Boston, Louisiana, and New York, Irish fighters were trained and armed under the radar, all of it fed by whiskey profits and political corruption. And if you dig deeper, it ties right back into the old alliance between secret societies and ruling classes, people who had learned generations earlier how to move in the shadows. Back in Europe, the kings ruled under divine right. You spoke against the church or the crown, you burned. But not every dissenter could be killed. Especially not the scientists, the engineers, the thinkers. They were useful in war. So, they were tolerated. Quietly. Secretly. And many of them formed societies underground. That's where modern Freemasonry was born. Not in the light, but in the dark, under pressure. These societies grew. They crossed borders. And when the New World was discovered, they crossed oceans. America became a petri dish for secret ideologies. The Founding Fathers weren't ordinary men. They were all part of secret orders. They thought in terms of centuries, not election cycles. They used religion not as belief, but as a tool. It didn't matter if it was Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. What mattered was control. They hijacked belief systems to keep the next generation in line, to keep the machine running. Over time, that machine turned into the American system we see today. If you stand in the way, you're eliminated. Ask anyone who's gone up against entrenched power and lived long enough to regret it. These elites, royals, bankers, aristocrats, they'll sacrifice their own if it keeps the machine moving. Historically, they've given away sons and daughters to form alliances, to kill rival bloodlines, even for literal sacrifice under religious pretense. That's how they operate. Cold, calculated, generational. The working class, nothing but fuel. The middle class, a threat. Something to be hollowed out, kept in debt, distracted, and replaceable. Anyone above that, without elite blood, bled dry, brought down, or bought off. And while all this unfolds, they tell you to pay your taxes, be grateful, and keep your head down. As LBJ once said, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. That quote wasn't just about race. It was about class, about distraction, division, control. Today, America wears the mask of a democracy, but behind the curtain, it's an oligarchy dressed in red, white, and blue. The elites don't care for whom you vote. They already own the board. And if you want to know how we got here, it started a long time ago, with secret societies, backroom deals, and men who never stopped thinking 100 years ahead. The Mafia was not just criminals, but as inheritors of something older, something that mixed tradition, secrecy, and blood. The Mafia was never separate from the church. In fact, it couldn't have existed without it. During the dark days when Rome turned a blind eye, the Mafia protected the church. And when the church was under siege, it looked the other way and let the Mafia do what it had to do. They became one and the same. In Sicily, some mafiosi are still venerated like saints. You see the same thing with the cartels in Mexico: shrines, prayers, saints with blood on their hands. Places like Corsica and Sicily breed that hybrid: part religious cult, part criminal empire, part political apparatus. When that formula got exported to America, it mutated into something more dangerous, because over here, the government had left entire populations behind. That's the vacuum the Mafia stepped into. They built a shadow government. When the state failed, the Mafia stepped in. You needed protection? They gave it, for a price. You wanted your shop left alone? You paid. You wanted your business to grow? They connected you to their suppliers, and suddenly, your profits exploded. You got their protection. They got a cut. It worked because the government didn't. When the banks wouldn't lend to immigrants, too risky, no collateral, wrong surname, the Mafia fronted the money. Italian, Jewish, Irish, didn't matter. The capital came from organized crime, and when the legal system only protected the rich, the Mafia handled justice its own way, quick and final. But by the 1950s, the game changed. Lucky Luciano figured out who the real boss was, and it wasn't some street tough. It was the governor. Luciano organized criminal syndicates the way CEOs build corporations, vertically integrated, supply chains tight, and customer service delivered. Booze, gambling, narcotics, women, whatever America wanted, the Mafia delivered. And they didn't hoard the money. They reinvested it into the American economy: nightclubs, casinos, construction, unions. They bought political influence, and they bought legitimacy. They even built bridges to US intelligence. The message was simple: we're not outsiders. We're one of you. And for a while it worked. They started walking in rooms they were never supposed to enter. Luciano, Costello, Lansky, They wanted in. They wanted acceptance. They wanted to sit at the same table as the aristocrats. But deep down, they knew the truth. Luciano once told Costello, after a meeting with Democratic Party leaders, "Can't you feel it? These people look at us like garbage from Harlem." Costello just laughed. "I don't want their respect. I want their loyalty. I want them to do what I tell them to do." That was the problem. The Mafia thought short-term. They wanted power now. If they had played it long, they would have backed real allies, Italian Catholics who could protect them politically. Instead, they threw in with aristocrats who smiled, took their money, and then turned them on. Luciano went to prison. Costello was run out to Louisiana. Lansky fled to Havana. Siegel to California. FDR got the presidency, but the mob got burned. Luciano had forgotten something that should have been obvious. In 1891, 11 Sicilian immigrants were lynched in New Orleans. When reporters asked about it, the future president said it was a good thing. As far as the ruling class was concerned, Italians were useful until they weren't. But Luciano wasn't just a gangster. He understood power. From prison, he built ties with the FBI, then with naval intelligence, then with the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. When it came time to invade Sicily during World War II, Luciano made it easy. He knew the terrain. He had people on the ground. He played ball. Officially, he was deported to Italy. In reality, he was strategically placed. Operation Gladio was already being sketched, a covert network to keep Europe from falling to communism. Luciano did his part, then handed off control to local Sicilian bosses. By then, the Americans were shipping in mobsters like Joe Adonis, just in case anyone needed reminding who was in charge. This wasn't accidental. The American elite knew Europe was going to collapse. Empires always do. And before they fall, they do what all dying empires do. They start a war. Britain collapsed after World War II. Bankrupt, no colonies. Lost India, lost the Suez Canal. By 1954, there was no British Empire, just a flag and a memory. The new empire was American. NATO became the leash, Gladio the dagger, and the Mafia, both in Europe and in America, became the unofficial enforcers. By the 1950s, America was trying to solve the world's problems but couldn't solve its own. The hypocrisy was enormous. The public didn't want global domination. They just wanted their boys home. But it didn't matter. The machine had momentum. America had dropped the first nuclear bomb and then tried to stop anyone else from using one. That wasn't the real war, though. When the Soviets got the bomb, Washington panicked. The enemy wasn't military. It was ideological. Communism, socialism. Roosevelt had dabbled in both. His New Deal was practically Marxist by today's standards. He taxed the rich, gave jobs to the poor, declared war on Wall Street. And when he needed a cleaner, he sent in Joseph Kennedy. Roosevelt played the game differently. He watched as fascists and monarchies fell apart, then picked up the pieces when they collapsed. He knew Pearl Harbor was coming. The code had been broken, but he let it happen. He needed an excuse. Once Japan struck, Hitler made the mistake of declaring war, and America crushed them both. Then came the rebuild. America didn't just win the war, it loaned the world the money to rebuild, and collected interest. But the people were tired. They wanted out. What they didn't know was that the game had only just begun. Behind the curtain, organized crime was now embedded in politics. Hoover still denied the Mafia even existed, but it was already too late. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 exposed it all. Cops thought they were busting some mob sit-down. What they really found were councilmen, political fixers, and public officials, made men in suits, hiding in plain sight. And that was only 60 or 80 of them. There were hundreds more. The Mafia was pulling in millions, billions by today's numbers. And they owned politicians, judges, unions, even parts of law enforcement. They weren't just criminals anymore. They were lobbyists. They sat alongside the military-industrial complex, the Jewish lobbying networks, and the energy giants. All they had to do was offer America a piece of the pie, and America sent in the Marines. They backed dictators in Cuba, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. It didn't matter. As long as the mob got paid and communists got crushed, they were on the team. From the days of FDR, they had learned one thing: set the stage, create the crisis, and move in with the solution. That strategy didn't die with Luciano. It evolved, and it's still running, just wearing a better suit. If America wants to change, it has to start by doing what every human being has to do when they've hit the wall. Look in the mirror. Not the flag-waving anthem-sing version. The real one. The version that owns every mistake. Not to beat itself up, but to finally understand what went wrong and how to fix it. That's how growth happens. That's how rehab starts. That's how revolutions begin. You hold up the mirror and look at yourself. Now do that to a nation. Because the truth is, America was never what it claimed to be. The slogans, equality, liberty, democracy, were always the storefront. Behind the counter was a quite different business, built by secret societies fleeing Europe. Masons, Christian Zionists, aristocrats in exile. They didn't land in America for peace. They came to build something, and they didn't care how long it took. 10 years, 100, 1,000. They were playing for permanence. Once the settlers arrived, the project kicked off. A new country for old money. And once the British were pushed out, America turned inward, but only long enough to fight over what came next. The Constitution was written in ink, but the system it protected was written in hypocrisy. All men are created equal. That didn't apply to the enslaved. It didn't apply to the native. It didn't apply to the immigrant or the poor. The land of the free? Unless you were Japanese during World War II, and then you were thrown in camps. Or Mexican, working fields in 100-degree heat for pennies. Or black, living under Jim Crow, hunted for looking the wrong way. Or Irish, Polish, or Italian in the early 20th century. Spit on, beat down, worked to death. This wasn't the dream. It was a machine, one that chewed people up. And the machine ran smoothly because everyone was told the same lie. If you just work hard enough, you'll make it. But they were never supposed to make it. They were labor. They were fuel. And when they realized it, they hit the streets. They unionized. They bled for it. Fought cops, thugs, Pinkertons. Got locked up and beaten down so that their kids could one day have a shot at a house, a pension, a future. That was the fight that built the Golden Age. The one the 1960s rode on. The one that gave you decent wages, public education, weekends off. But it didn't last. Because while the people were building their America, the elites were taking it back. Slowly, quietly, systematically. You want to know how far it went? Look at how deeply organized crime got into the system. It started with Al Smith, the first presidential candidate, who organized crime tried to buy in the 1920s. He didn't make it. But they kept trying. They had a hand in Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy, Johnson. The last president to sit down with them face to face. Jimmy Carter. But the influence didn't stop. It kept flowing, through Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton. Clinton, who watched drugs move through Arkansas like it was an open pipeline. The same thing played out in law enforcement. If you think this is new, think again. Prohibition turned entire police departments into extensions of the mob. Luciano himself said it. Every high-ranking commissioner is in the undertaker's pocket. He wasn't exaggerating. In the UK, the Masons run parts of law enforcement like a private club. Promotions, assignments, investigations, controlled internally. America has the same thing, But it's not just Masons. It's the Mafia. It's political fixers. It's the old boys network with new toys. People get promoted if they're part of the system. If they're not, they're gone. And it's not just cops. It's the FBI. The CIA intelligence agencies have been working with organized crime since the early 20th century. During World War II, they used the Mafia to help invade Sicily. Later, they used mobsters in Europe to undermine communists during the Cold War. And when it came to blackmail, they mastered it. If you want to understand how America got to Jeffrey Epstein, don't start with Epstein. Start with Roy Cohn. Start with McCarthy. Start with J. Edgar Hoover. Cohn was the gateway, a power broker, a political hitman, a closeted operative who knew everyone's secrets. He trained Trump. He had ties to Hoover. Hoover, who ran the FBI like a personal fortress while denying organized crime even existed. Hoover, who was rumored to be compromised himself, yet held more blackmail files than the mob. He didn't fight the Mafia. He learned from them. So how do you get Epstein? You build a system where the worst people rise, and the rest are too afraid to stop them. Where favors and secrets matter more than votes and laws. Where corruption isn't the exception, it's the infrastructure. You want to fix America? Then treat it like a man who's hit rock bottom. Hold up the mirror. Tell the truth. No more slogans. No more lies. You weren't given a dream. You were sold one. And to get it back, the real one, you're going to have to fight like hell again. Unionize. Organize. Bleed, if you have to. That's how your grandparents did it. That's how you'll have to do it too. Because this system, it doesn't care if you starve or suffer or disappear. It only cares if you submit. Propaganda works best when you don't know it's propaganda. You've seen it. Every time Hollywood wants to show the Soviet Union in a movie, you get the same visuals. The hammer and sickle waving in a chilly wind, red flags, brutalist architecture, grey skies, stoic soldiers with cold eyes and bigger guns. The implication is clear. This is the enemy. Cold, oppressive, inhuman. It's not by accident. It's by design. Propaganda is an art form, and every major power has used it. Britain weaponized it across its empire. Divide and conquer wasn't just a military strategy. It was a psychological operation. In India, Africa, the Middle East, the British mastered the tactic of turning neighbor against neighbor, tribe against tribe, language against language. Let them bleed each other dry, then step in and take what's left. America did the same. It just looked different. The US didn't have kings or queens. It had corporate kings. Men like Sam Zamurri, the real banana king of the early 20th century. Zamurri didn't rule from a throne. He ruled from boardrooms, controlling Guatemala, Honduras, Colombia, and swaths of Central America like it was his private estate. He built railroads, docks, radio towers, runways, not for the locals but for his logistics. He bought and sold governments the way others shuffled cards. He had more power than most nations. In the 1930s, he was so powerful he took on Huey Long, and even Franklin D. Roosevelt kept a wary distance. But while America's oligarchs moved in shadows, the German propaganda machine moved with terrifying precision, openly, proudly, and on an industrial scale. In Nazi Germany, propaganda wasn't a side operation. It was the central nervous system of the state. It shaped minds. It created enemies. It turned neighbors into informants, citizens into soldiers, and mass murder into civic duty. The man behind it? Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda and Public Enlightenment. Goebbels didn't just lie. He institutionalized lies. He took over Germany's entire media infrastructure and transformed it into a weapon. Newspapers? They were nationalized. Headlines were written in Berlin, not in newsrooms. Radio? Mass distributed to the public via cheap sets called the Volksempfänger, which could only receive Nazi broadcasts. Cinema, controlled by the state. Directors like Leni Riefenstahl produced epics like Triumph of the Will, glorifying Hitler as a god and the Reich as destiny. Education? Rewritten. Classrooms taught racial theory and obedience. Books were burned. Jazz was banned. Modern art was criminal. Posters and leaflets flooded the streets and skies, turning Jews into rats, enemies into monsters, and Hitler into Germany's savior. They weaponized identity. They turned ideology into a spectacle. It wasn't just what people heard, it was what they felt. Fear, rage, pride, unity. Goebbels used emotion like a surgeon uses a scalpel. They weren't just conditioning the German mind, they were manufacturing it. The US wanted to reach that level of propaganda control, not openly. And now they knew how to play the game. They used race, religion, and fear during election cycles. They shaped public opinion through media empires. They kept the country divided when it needed unity, distracted when it needed clarity. But the illusion had to stay intact. America told its people they lived in a free land, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. But it was always split. North capitalism, South segregation, and a forgotten middle ground that served both. And behind the dream, there was always a machine. White supremacists, elites, secret societies, corporate titans, and eventually, organized crime. Because while Washington told the world it stood for democracy, real power lived elsewhere. In smoke-filled rooms, backroom deals, and blackmail files. You want to know how far it went? Look at the presidents. The first one organized crime tried to buy was Al Smith in the 1920s. He didn't get in. But from that moment on, organized crime had its hooks in every White House. Truman, Eisenhower, Nixon, Kennedy, Johnson, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton. No party lines, just access. You think the Clintons didn't know drugs were flying through Arkansas in the 80s? You think Bush Sr. didn't have intelligence ties to the same agencies that partnered with traffickers during the Cold War? Organized crime didn't just operate outside the law. It embedded itself into law enforcement, into police departments, into federal agencies. Prohibition made it possible. The Great Depression made it necessary. And J. Edgar Hoover made it permanent. Hoover denied the Mafia existed while working with Roy Cohn, the man who would later mentor Donald Trump. Roy Cohn, who kept dirt on everyone and walked free for decades. Roy Cohn, who taught the elites how to use blackmail as currency. And, from Roy Cohn, you get to Jeffrey Epstein. Don't start at the island, start at the infrastructure. You want to know how Epstein got protection? Look at how the system was built, through decades of compromised agents, secret societies, and a blackmail economy that began in the 1950s and never stopped growing. Epstein was just the upgrade. What happens when you chase a noble cause for selfish reasons? Nothing. Because it was never about the cause to begin with. That's exactly what happened to Estes Kefauver in the 1950s. He came out swinging, said he was going after the Mafia, cleaning up America, exposing the rot. And for a moment, people believed it. He had the look, the words, the television. He sat in front of the cameras and made history. The Kefauver hearings, 1951. The first time the American people saw organized crime paraded in front of them, coast to coast, on live TV. Mobsters blinking under the lights. Politicians pretend to be shocked. But as soon as the microphones turned off, Kefauver turned toward something else, a presidential campaign. He'd gone state to state, headline to headline, all on the taxpayer's dime. Genius, really. He used the Mafia to launch himself into the spotlight, then walked away when it no longer served him. The hearings, they changed nothing. The Mafia wasn't weakened, it was legitimized. The government had just put them on national TV and still couldn't stop them. Power doesn't flinch under a spotlight. It thrives in the shadows. That's where the Mafia lived. These guys weren't thugs with brass knuckles. They were a secret society, with oaths, rituals, and rules older than the Republic. Omerta wasn't just a code, it was religion. In Sicily, they were treated like nobility. In America, they ruled in the dark, presidents of the underworld, governors of silence. And while Kefauver played prosecutor on TV, the Mafia got to work. They weren't the only ones. Joseph Kennedy, the bootlegger turned ambassador, had spent the Roosevelt years quietly sympathizing with fascism. He respected how the Nazis handled business. Order, control, that kind of clarity. He never got over losing it. And now, America had dropped 2 nukes on Japan, and the Soviets had one of their own. How? Simple. Secrets were leaked. American scientists, some with communist leanings, some with quiet sympathies, slipped technology to the Russians. Maybe ideology, maybe guilt, maybe just ego. But it worked. The Soviets caught up, and that changed everything. America panicked. Suddenly there were whispers of communist spies inside the government, inside the labs, inside the military, inside your neighborhood. It didn't matter how much truth was in it. Fear doesn't need precision, it just needs direction. The public wanted blood. So Washington gave them McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy walked into Congress and lit a match. He had names, lists, accusations, no evidence, but plenty of cameras. He had money behind him, press behind him, and most of all, he had Roy Cohn. Ruthless, brilliant, untouchable. Cohn wasn't just McCarthy's hatchet man, he was his architect. He knew the real play, control the narrative, and you control the country. McCarthy and Cohn didn't go after just enemies. They went after Americans, actors, writers, teachers, civil servants. Anyone who questioned them was labeled a traitor. Treason by suspicion, guilt by association. And the crowd ate it up. You want to rule the world? First, you learn how to rule your own people. Make them obedient. Make them scared. Make them hate each other. That's what the British had taught the Americans for generations. If you want to keep control, never let your people unite. Divide them, confuse them, feed them fear like candy. And that's exactly what McCarthy did. Nobody stopped him, not at first, because fear sells. It raises money. It wins elections. And while everyone was busy pointing fingers at communists that may or may not have existed, the real power structures, the Mafia, the intelligence community, the aristocrats, the lobbyists, were settling in comfortably. They weren't afraid of McCarthy. Hell, they were thriving under him. Cohn would go on to become one of the most connected men in American politics. He would mentor presidents, broker judges, bury enemies, and the network he built, the legal blackmail machine, would one day lead directly to Jeffrey Epstein. But that's later. Back in the 50s, while America turned on itself and chased ghosts, the real players were already inside the system, wearing suits, attending galas, funding campaigns, running cities, the hearings, the trials, the televised crusades. They were all theatre. The house was already on fire, and everyone was busy watching the shadows on the wall. It was 1950. America was booming. Contemporary music was cracking through the radios. Teenagers were dancing to something their parents didn't understand. Television was everywhere. Jazz met rock. Cities buzzed with life. It was a cultural wave, unstoppable and loud. A new kind of American energy was being born. But the old guard, they weren't done, not even close. They needed something to clamp it all down. A counterweight to the rhythm, the freedom, the new blood. Something to remind the country that no matter how bright it glowed, there was still a threat in the dark. And that's when Joseph McCarthy walked in. He didn't come alone. He had Roy Cohn at his side, young, ruthless, brilliant, and J. Edgar Hoover watching from the rafters, running the FBI like a personal empire. Behind them were the elite, old money, old power, old scores to settle. McCarthy wasn't building a case. He was throwing darts in the dark. Accusations flew like confetti. Spies, traitors, Reds under the bed. He had Robert F. Kennedy on his legal team and Joseph Kennedy in his corner. It wasn't about truth. It was about spectacle, fear, control. And with that power, they launched one of the most dangerous intelligence operations in American history. Operation Paperclip. As World War II ended, the Americans moved into Germany fast, not just to beat the Soviets, but to kidnap the Reich's top minds. Scientists, engineers, propagandists, the architects of the Nazi machine. They didn't care if the ink was still wet on their war crimes. If you were smart enough, useful enough, you got a free pass. The Americans wanted to understand something crucial. How the hell did Germany get its own people to turn on each other? How do you make a country swallow genocide and thank you for it? The Nazis had mastered that answer, and now the US wanted the playbook. So the propaganda specialists from Berlin were handed fresh suits, new names, and desks in Washington, D.C. The enemy hadn't been defeated. It had been recruited. The new threat wasn't Germany. It was socialism. America had hated it since 1917, when the Bolsheviks dragged the Russian royals into a basement and executed the entire line. The British hated the Soviets. The French hated them. Even the Nazis, who'd lost to them, hated them. And now America needed to turn the screws, make the people hate the very allies they'd just fought beside. Soldiers who had marched shoulder to shoulder with the Red Army were now expected to see them as evil. That required propaganda, real propaganda, and this time they had professionals running the show. Step 1, teach superiority. The Nazis called it Aryan purity. The Americans called it exceptionalism. You tell a nation they are God's chosen people, the last beacon of freedom, the only righteous power in history. Same thing the British told their subjects during empire, that the king spoke directly to God, that their rule was destiny. Now America was doing the same, not just through church sermons or campaign speeches, but in schools. Every kid had to stand up, hand on heart, pledge of allegiance, every day. Refuse? You weren't a free thinker. You were a suspect. Because if the land is absolutely free, no one needs to pledge anything. But by then, it wasn't about freedom. It was about obedience. Freedom was just branding. Educational films started rolling into classrooms. State-funded documentaries, sanitized versions of history, fear-drenched stories of communist threats. The church jumped in too, fire and brimstone sermons against the godless red menace. That's how you make a child love the flag and hate the other. Then came Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of leaking nuclear secrets to the Soviets. It didn't matter whether the case was airtight. What mattered was the moment. They were Americans, Jewish, intellectual, left-leaning, perfect targets. They became the poster couple for betrayal. The state made an example of them. Spy hysteria was the new witch hunt. Everyone was suspected. Teachers, writers, actors, neighbors. You didn't need evidence, just a whisper, and your life was over. The nation had entered a paranoid trance. The government didn't need to pass new laws. They just needed the people to police each other. This wasn't national defense. It was psychological warfare. It wasn't protection. It was programming. And like the Nazis taught them, the trick was never about brute force. It was about control, about what people believed, what they feared, and what they were willing to do in the name of that fear. Sing Sing prison. 2 condemned prisoners, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, sit in separate death row cells, counting down the days until the state throws the switch. Husband and wife, convicted Soviet spies. No deals, no confessions, just silence and waiting. They weren't supposed to be famous. They were supposed to disappear. Convicted under Title 50, Section 32 of the U.S. Code, they were the first civilians in American history to get the death penalty for espionage. Originally scheduled to die in May 1951, they could have slipped into obscurity, a footnote in Cold War headlines. Instead, they became martyrs in a global propaganda war. Their silence was everything. While other Soviet agents cracked, Klaus Fuchs, Harry Gold, and Ethel's own brother David Greenglass, the Rosenbergs didn't budge. They refused to name names. And that's when the Communist Party realized what it had. Two true believers, ready to die without flipping. At trial, the party kept its distance. The Daily Worker didn't cover the case. No rallies, no protests. But once it became clear the Rosenbergs weren't talking, not now, not ever, Moscow greenlit the campaign. And the message was simple. Turn two convicted traitors into victims of American imperialism. The propaganda machine went into overdrive. Suddenly, the Daily Worker couldn't shut up. Articles about the Rosenberg children, tear-streaked editorials, letters from death row, picketers outside embassies, celebrities, activists, and communist fronts around the world joined the chorus. The US wasn't executing spies, they said. It was executing Jews. It was executing parents. It was executing peace. Never mind that Judge Kaufman, lead prosecutor Irving Sapol, and appellate Judge Jerome Frank were all Jewish. Never mind that Julius had abandoned rabbinical training for Marxist politics. That didn't fit the story. Moscow needed martyrs. The Rosenbergs fit the part. Behind the curtain, the Soviets knew the risk. The Rosenbergs' silence couldn't be guaranteed until they were dead. But, until then, they were useful. To stir anger in foreign capitals, to poison American credibility abroad, to distract from Stalin's own anti-Semitic purges. Inside Sing Sing, Ethel played the role to perfection. The eighth woman ever slated to die in the chair, she was calm, polite, read books, writing letters to her sons, Michael and Robert. Sometimes she played handball with the matrons. Her supporters described her as serene. She knew the part she was playing. Julius was more animated. He wrote letters too, some of which ended up in the Daily Worker. When the prison librarian sent him books on American freedom and democracy, he snapped. He thought it was a setup, another ploy to break him. He wrote, "I will not crawl." Not then, not ever. Even when their kids asked him to explain the electric chair, he didn't flinch. He described it, wires, switch, the whole thing, like he was talking about a machine part. He'd gone full ideologue. To him, death was part of the job. But the facts don't change. The Rosenbergs were Soviet agents. Julius had slipped a proximity fuse, one of America's most sensitive military secrets, out of an electronics plant while working with the Signal Corps. The same fuse was later used against US pilots in Korea. He wasn't working alone. Ethel wasn't some housewife dragged into her husband's mess. As Judge Kaufman said, she was a full-fledged partner. She helped recruit her brother, David Greenglass, a machinist stationed at Los Alamos. Greenglass gave up bomb specs. Ethel typed them. Julius passed them to his Russian contact, Soviet Vice Consul Anatoly Yakovlev. The damage was massive. Submarine detection systems, fire control technician rocket satellite data. A treasure chest of secrets. And it didn't stop after the war. The Rosenbergs kept working long after Russia stopped being an ally. Kaufman didn't hand down the sentence lightly. He prayed on it, thought about it for days in his synagogue. When he sentenced them, he said, Only the Lord can find mercy for what you have done. He called their crime worse than murder. Still, the pressure was enormous. Activists, politicians, foreign dignitaries, they all lobbied him. But Kaufman didn't blink. He gave the Rosenbergs every legal option. Their lawyer, Emanuel Bloch, ran the full circuit: retrials, appeals, clemency. Nothing stuck. Even now, as execution nears, the appeals keep coming. Organized, strategic, orchestrated. But beneath the global noise, Julius and Ethel are already gone. They're no longer people. They're symbols. Moscow's little people crushed by capitalism. America's cautionary tale. The irony. Just a few years earlier, they were ordinary New Yorkers, a couple from the Lower East Side trying to make it. Julius studied electrical engineering at City College. Ethel wanted to be a singer but became a stenographer. They married in 1939, scraping by in a Knickerbocker Village apartment. Nobody really knows why they turned. Maybe it was CCNY, hotbed of radical politics in the 1930s. Maybe it was ambition. Maybe it was belief. But once they were in deep. Julius recruited quietly, starting with friends like Morton Sabel and Max Ehrlicher, both working defense jobs in Washington. He rose fast, charming his superiors and building a network inside the Signal Corps. By 1944, he wasn't reporting to local party bosses anymore. He was working straight for Moscow. And when Greenglass landed at Los Alamos, a machinist, not a physicist, but close enough. The Rosenbergs knew they had the score of a lifetime. They celebrated that night. They were ready. They thought it would be easy. Greenglass was loyal, if not particularly bright. He looked up to Julius like a mentor. Julius gave him tools, manuals, communist pamphlets. He brought him in young. The Communist Youth League was just the beginning. Eventually, Greenglass handed over details of the bomb, sketches, dimensions, and implosion methods. Everything he knew. And now, nearly a decade later, they're still not talking. Not even for their kids, not even to save their own lives. They believe death will make them legends. The party agrees. Judge Kaufman saw it coming. In his final statement, he wrote, "Their lips have remained sealed, and they prefer the glory which they believe will be theirs by martyrdom, bestowed by those who enlisted them in this diabolical conspiracy, and who, indeed, desire them to remain silent." November 1944. Ruth Greenglass, 20 years old and broke, was missing her husband. David had been drafted into the army a year and a half earlier, and now he was stationed somewhere called Los Alamos, New Mexico, a place so secret he couldn't even tell her why it mattered. She scraped together $150, planning to take a bus to see him for their second anniversary. Then a family emergency drained her savings. That's when the phone rang. It was Ethel Rosenberg, her sister-in-law. "Come to dinner," Ethel said. Ruth showed up at the Rosenbergs' small apartment near the Bowery. Julius and Ethel had news. Big news. David, they said, was working on a secret weapon, a bomb, something that could help end the war. But the real problem, they claimed, wasn't the Nazis. It was the Americans. Certain fascist elements in the US government were holding back key information from the Soviet Union, their supposed ally. Julius had a solution. Ruth should go to New Mexico and get the details directly from David. Memorize everything. Bring it back. Help Russia. Ruth hesitated. Ethel brushed it off. David would decide what was safe to share. Ruth agreed. Julius gave her the $150 she needed. She boarded a bus to Los Alamos. Julius Rosenberg wasn't just a loyal communist. By that point, he was a key figure in the Soviet Union's American spy network. His Russian handler? Anatoly Yakovlev, the deputy Soviet vice consul in New York. Yakovlev's requests were precise. number of workers at Los Alamos, names of scientists, how the facility was guarded, how far it was from Santa Fe. At first, David Greenglass was wary, but his loyalty to Julius and Ethel ran deep. They'd helped him, mentored him, and now he trusted them. He gave Ruth the details. The names she brought back were explosive: Robert Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr, Harold Urey, George Kistiakowsky, all heavyweights in nuclear science. Yakovlev was thrilled. Julius told Ruth she did decent work. By New Year's Day, 1945, David was back in New York on leave. Julius moved fast. He got Greenglass to write out everything he knew, and Ethel, used to deciphering her brother's messy handwriting, typed it all up. Among the details, the design of the A-bomb's explosive lens system, the very trigger mechanism that made fission possible. On that same visit, Julius arranged a face-to-face between David and a Russian contact. David borrowed a car and drove through the back streets of Lower Manhattan with a man introduced only as the courier. It was a 20-minute ride. Greenglass talked. The Russian listened. Afterward, Julius told David to expect more contacts. He introduced him to Anne Sidorovich, another Soviet courier. If she showed up in Albuquerque, Ruth was to set up a safe apartment, paid for by friends. For security, Julius handed Ruth a torn Jell-O box, a makeshift recognition signal. The other half would be carried by the courier. It worked. In June 1945, weeks before the first bomb test in the New Mexico desert, Harry Gold showed up at the Greenglass apartment. He handed Ruth the matching half of the Jell-O box and a $500 envelope from Yakovlev. In return, Greenglass gave Gold sketches of the lens mold. Gold later described the information as extremely valuable. When David returned to New York that fall, he brought more secrets: the trigger mechanism used in the Nagasaki bomb. Ethel typed up an 11-page report. Julius gave David another $200 and pushed him to apply for a civilian post at Los Alamos to keep the intelligence flowing. David didn't bite. He left the army with an honorable discharge, came home, and joined Julius in a failing machine shop. Meanwhile, Julius, already fired from his Signal Corps job after an FBI background check flagged his Communist Party membership, kept working his network. No charges were filed, just a quiet dismissal. He pretended to be outraged. Privately, he was relieved. Still, Julius stayed active. He tried to get Greenglass back into school, on the Soviets' dime. He continued pushing old college contacts like Morton Sobel and Max Ilitcher for technical data. He was happy, confident. The Soviets were rewarding him. Fancy watches, pocket cash, quiet praise. When President Truman announced the USSR had tested an atomic bomb, the Rosenbergs celebrated. Then came February 1950, and the headlines that would bring their world crashing down. Klaus Fuchs had been arrested in London, and he was talking. The moment Fuchs got picked up, Julius knew what was coming. He ran straight to Greenglass's apartment on the Lower East Side. There was panic in his voice. Fuchs had worked in the same Soviet network. Worse, he'd been connected, indirectly, to Harry Gold. David didn't know Fuchs, but he knew Gold. He'd passed classified information to Gold for $500, money handed over by none other than Yakovlev. Julius, scrambling, didn't know that Fuchs only knew Gold by his code name, Raymond. But the FBI had a description, and they were closing in. Over the next 3 months, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were in full-blown crisis mode. They had personal tensions with Greenglass. He wanted a bigger cut of the post-war business. He knew too much. He was unstable. Still, Julius begged him to flee the country. He promised to pay off Greenglass's debts, even checked with a doctor about vaccines for foreign travel. The plan was set: Mexico, then Sweden, then Czechoslovakia, and finally Moscow. Where a job waited, Greenglass refused. Then Gold got arrested. Julius upped the pressure. He handed Greenglass $1,000, promised more, gave bizarre instructions about how to spot Soviet agents en route. In June, Greenglass had passport photos taken for his family. Julius gave him $4,000, but David wavered again. He handed the money to a relative for safekeeping. He stayed put. Then came the break. Harry Gold confessed. His statement ran for pages. Eventually he named Greenglass. The FBI brought David in. He didn't resist. If anything, he was relieved. Greenglass flipped fast. He agreed to cooperate. His testimony would send Julius and Ethel to the electric chair. He would later say it was Ethel who convinced him not to run, not to risk the escape. At the same time, Morton Sobel, Rosenberg's old college friend and co-conspirator, tried to disappear. He made it to Mexico, using aliases and exit plans similar to what Julius gave Greenglass. Sobel didn't make it far. The Mexican police picked him up and sent him back to Texas. Sobel was indicted, convicted, and sentenced to 30 years under the Espionage Act of 1917. But the real mystery: why hadn't the Rosenbergs fled? By the time they warned Greenglass, they were already under suspicion. But instead of running, they stayed. Only in late May or early June 1950, long after the net had tightened, did they finally go to Ben Schneider's shop on Park Row to have passport photos taken. Schneider, a surprise government witness, remembered them clearly. It was a Saturday, and they spent $9 on pictures. When asked about their travel plans, Ethel said something about France and a family endowment. The government used it to show intent. The jury saw it as guilt. Judge Irving Kaufman later said it outright. Flight is a circumstance the jury may consider as an indication of consciousness of guilt. It was supposed to be the trial of the century, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of delivering America's most dangerous wartime secrets to the Soviets. But when the courtroom finally arrived in 1951, much of the country was looking elsewhere. The Rosenberg trial went head-to-head with the Kefauver hearings, a televised spectacle full of gangsters, gamblers, and crooked politicians. Viewers tuned in to watch Frank Costello's twitching hands, Joe Adonis's slick suits, Virginia Hill's smirking disdain. Meanwhile, across town, a far more serious case unfolded in near silence. The spy trial didn't have the ratings, but it had the stakes. The US government didn't fumble the prosecution. The case was built tight and clean, led by US Attorney Irving Sapol, who'd later become a federal judge, Miles Lane, Roy Cohn, and a stacked team of federal prosecutors. The investigation had been textbook, thanks to some of the best counterintelligence work in the FBI's history. The evidence was devastating. David Greenglass, Ethel's brother and Julius's co-conspirator, took the stand. So did Ruth Greenglass, who testified in detail about the stolen atomic secrets, the money, and the courier network. Harry Gold, the Soviet runner, told the court about the Jello box signal and his meetings with Greenglass. Elizabeth Bentley, an ex-Soviet agent turned witness, linked Julius to senior communist operatives like Jacob Golos. Max Ellicher, a longtime friend, confirmed Rosenberg's recruiting tactics inside the government. Even the escape plan was on the table. A doctor testified about shots the Rosenbergs asked about for travel to Mexico. A photographer recalled them coming in for passport photos, bringing their kids, spending cash, asking odd questions. The defense, led by Emanuel Bloch, pushed back. He attacked witnesses, questioned motives, claimed the FBI had leaned too hard. In appeals, he'd claimed some testimony was coerced or perjured. But at the close of trial, he struck a different tone. Despite any disagreements we may have had with the court, Bloch told Judge Kaufman, we feel that the trial has been conducted with the dignity and decorum that befits an American courtroom. The exhibits told the rest. Greenglass's drawings, retyped by Ethel, matched Soviet bomb specs. The paper wrapping used for the cash gold gave David. Deposit slips showing when the green glasses banked the money. Passport photos. The $4,000 Julius gave David to flee. And Gold's detailed story. How he met David in Albuquerque in 1945, used a torn Jell-O box to verify his identity, and passed on cash from Soviet Vice Consul Yakovlev, sealed it. When the Rosenbergs took the stand, they gave little. They invoked the Fifth again and again, especially on any questions about the Communist Party. Ethel, calm and composed, even refused to confirm signing a communist petition, something she'd already admitted before the grand jury. "Did you ever talk about your brother's work at Los Alamos?" "I refuse to answer on the grounds it may incriminate me." "Did Julius get fired from the Army's Signal Corps for communist ties?" "I refuse to answer." Over and over. The phrase became her shield, and the jury noticed. The appeals came fast. Courts upheld the verdict again and again. They said the charge wasn't vague. The trial was fair. The sentence didn't violate the Constitution. The law was clear. Delivering national defense information to a foreign power in wartime could carry up to 30 years, or death. Judge Kaufman chose death. In Paris, at a communist-led rally, Jean-Paul Sartre shouted, "The judge never proved their guilt." But guilt wasn't Kaufman's job. The jury found the Rosenbergs guilty. Kaufman's role was sentencing. He didn't rush it. He didn't ask the prosecutors for a recommendation. "The responsibility," Kaufman said, "is so great that the court alone should assume it." Then came his now famous line, "Your crime is worse than murder." He believed it. He delivered the sentence himself. Irving Sapol, the prosecutor, agreed. From there, the case became one of the most contested and publicized appeals in modern American legal history. They were set to die in May 1951. The Second Circuit, Judges Swan, Chase, and Jerome Frank, upheld the conviction unanimously in February 1952. Rehearing requests were denied. The Supreme Court declined review. Bloch kept pushing. He filed appeals through the fall and winter, even trying to disqualify Kaufman from further decisions. Kaufman stepped aside. Chief Judge John C. Knox reassigned the case to Judge Sylvester Ryan. Ryan denied the motion in December 1952. The Rosenbergs' last hope, a sentence reduction, brought them back to Kaufman one final time. It was emotional. "Tell me where I erred," Kaufman asked Bloch. "You have in your hands the fate of two human beings," Bloch said. "They're soft, sweet people. Parents. They love their children like you love yours. God, Your Honor, please, consult your conscience." Kaufman looked at him. "If I felt that way for an instant," he said, "I'd change." But he didn't. The Espionage Act gave him options: life in prison, 20 years, or death. He chose death, and explained why. He'd received tens of thousands of letters. Many carried communist talking points, most were pure pressure. "When the day comes that we're swayed by pressure," he said, "we might as well close the doors of justice." The Rosenbergs, he believed, weren't just spies. They were loyal operatives, unwavering, dangerous, and willing to do it again. "This court," Kaufman wrote, "has no doubt that if the Rosenbergs were ever to regain their freedom, they would continue in their deep-seated devotion to Soviet Russia, a devotion which caused them to choose martyrdom and keep their lips sealed." He ended the statement by quoting George Eliot, "There is a mercy which is weakness and even treason against the common good." And then he closed the book.